Hi, guys. Welcome to today's episode of the Pi Podcast. I am your host, Irene, and today we continue on the series of building generational wealth. Now, we're going to cover on a topic that I feel is normally quite neglected, and this is pensions. A lot of people don't really give too much thought into their pensions, and I can completely understand that because it can be an area that's a bit grey, that's a bit nuanced, and so just the amount of complexities involved just makes most people sort of quite shy in terms of tackling it head on. Now, I'm just going to say today's episode may be a bit triggering for some individuals. In the pension industry, we tend to refer to death a lot. And this is because we're looking at, projecting your earnings and projecting your age until the time that you die. And we're trying to understand how best to invest your money to be able to sustain your life post retirement until you do pass on. So I do apologize. We're not just trying to trigger you for, any apparent reason apart from the fact that it's the nature of what we are talking about when it comes to pensions. So, pensions are essentially a salary that individuals withdraw post retirement. There are two types of pensions that you could be involved in as an employee, either the defined contribution pension or the defined benefit pension. So, if you are one of those lucky individuals who's invested in a defined benefit pension scheme, then you are getting the holy grail of pensions. So, I would definitely try and hold on to that as much as possible. Now, I say this because the defined benefit pension scheme defines the benefit that you're going to earn at the end of your career. So they'll say we'll give you a percentage of, say, perhaps your final salary or your career average as your pension once you've retired. And so by investing today, that's the guarantee that we're giving you for the future. And that essentially takes the risk away from the employee and puts the risk on the employer. There is a cost involved in it. And so I think most employers have now shifted to what we call a defined contribution pension scheme. Now, a defined contribution pension scheme is one where they're defining the contribution that you make into your pension scheme. So it might say that your employer will contribute, say, 6% into your pension scheme. Or if you are part of the auto enrollment scheme, the defined contribution is 8%. So your employer, as a minimum, can contribute 3%, which means you then have to contribute 5%, and that's the defined contribution they're discussing. But as part of the auto enrollment scheme, if your employer decides to contribute 6%, then you contribute 2%, and so on and so forth. The minimum of the employer's contribution being that 3%, and the minimum contribution to the auto enrollment scheme being 8%. Now, because I've touched on the auto enrollment scheme, let me just explain what it is. This is essentially employees in the UK who are 22 years and over are automatically enrolled into a pension scheme provided that their salary hits a specific bracket. Now, if you're earning a certain amount, you're automatically enrolled into a pension scheme. So I would take my time to look at the rules around that. You do have the option to opt out of the auto enrollment, but I would suggest that if you are somebody who is looking to build generational wealth and think about life post retirement, then you definitely want to pay into your pension scheme. It's the prudent thing to do, and I'm going to explain to you why. We've said that for the defined contribution scheme, they do define the contribution that you're making into the pension scheme. What you get at the end of it is dependent on how the investments perform. Because they can't say to you that, because you're contributing, 6%, the employer contributes 6%, then you're going to get a pension of at least £20,000 a year. They cannot do that because it's dependent on the market performance. They can project some numbers and say to you that, for you to be able to earn this amount in the next, maybe 20, 30 years, this is what your contributions should look like. But again, those numbers are never guaranteed. The reason for that lack of guarantee is because the stock market cannot be sort of timed or predicted. And if you think about an incident such as COVID, who would have known that there'd be an incident, such as that would essentially, lead the stock market to sort of crumble as it did. And so these are events that we can't predict. And so if you're in a defined contribution pension scheme, the performance of the assets and the market is really the key determinant of how much you receive once you've retired, following the amount of contributions that have been paid in to your pension pot. So, How do we make the most of our pensions? Specifically for the defined contribution, because this then puts the risk on the employee. You're investing with no guarantees in the future because basically the market does what it does. And on average, the defined contribution pension scheme has done well and people have earned good pensions from it. So, like we do say in investments, there are risks that are there to be faced. But again, there's risks that are worth taking because you don't want to get to retirement age and you just literally have no plan. There is a projection that, people will live a lot longer. And so if you're somebody who's retiring at 55 or at 67 or 68 or 66, depending on what the retirement age is, and you live to say your 90s, it just means you've got at least 20 years of unemployment when you need to rely on your pension to be able to sustain your lifestyle. So, how do we maximize the defined contribution pension scheme? It's basically about understanding whether or not your employer has what we call a matching policy in place. How does a matching policy work? A matching policy works in the sense that your employer can say to you, as an example, that we'll contribute 6% as a base standard to every single employee's pension in the organization. Regardless of whether or not you contribute, we're going to give you a minimum of 6%. Okay? Now, the matching policy then says for every percentage that the employee pays into their pension scheme, the employer is going to match that like for like up to a certain point. So, if your matching policy says the employer can match like for like up to 6%, it means if you contribute 1%, the employer contributes 1%. If you contribute 4%, the employer contributes 4%. If you contribute 6%, the employer contributes 6%. Which means if you're somebody who's maximizing that contribution, you are putting a 6% contribution into your pension pot. Your employer is matching that by 6%, which then makes it 12%. And then adding on the initial base 6% that is a standard employer contribution for every single employee, regardless of whether or not they contribute. So you're looking at building a pension pot of 18% every single year. Now, what's not to like about that? Because those numbers seem quite exciting to me. And the way I think about this is this is a pay rise that you're getting. You're contributing 6%, your employer contributes 12%. They're giving you an extra 12% every year to save. Why would you not take that? And bearing in mind that any money that you pay into your pension, the 6% that you are contributing, is not taxed. So they withdraw that money, put it into your pension before it's taxed. There's a tax benefit there. There's a 12%, pay rise that's going into your pension to allow you to save for the future. And so these are things that we need to start thinking about very carefully when it comes to building generational wealth. Now, you get to retirement age and you've been building 18% in your pension over the years. But say, for example, which is what my story was, when I started working, I wasn't even like 20 years old and I was paying into a pension scheme. And my employer would match the pension scheme, but then I couldn't actually maximize that matching opportunity because my salary wasn't that high. And this is where your budget comes into play. You need to sit down and really create that budget and understand what flexibility you have in your budget to be able to increase your pension contributions. That's very important because you could be somebody who's saying, I want to pay off debt, which is very important. Pay off your debt first. Again, seek financial advice. I'm not a financial advisor. I'm just giving you my thought process on how I would do this. I would pay off my debt. I would then look at building an emergency fund for a couple of months. I would then look at what I'm contributing into my pension pot because for me, I would not start investing into an ISA when I haven't maximized my pension contribution, simply for the fact that in a pension, the 6% contribution that you're making there is tax free. what you're paying into an ISA, if you were to take that 6%, first of all, it's going to be taxed at whatever rate you're being taxed. At that point, you can then invest it into an ISA. So you're losing out on that tax benefit. So in your budget, you can try and play around with the numbers and see how much can you flexibly contribute into your pension pot to max the matching policy in order to make the most out of it. And then once you've done that, you can then proceed to make your ISA investments and ISA savings and so on and so forth. That's just my point of view. With that said, it could be a case of you gradually over the years investing, say, 1%. As your salary increases, it now goes to 2%. As it increases, you now pay 4% until you're able to max that matching policy. And that's an absolute win. That's a free pay rise. That's free money from your employer. Those are tax benefits that you definitely want to get hold of. So if you're somebody who's not really maybe paid attention to your pension scheme before, I think now is the time for you to look at your benefit statement, which is something that you get every single year, and look at your pension fund accounts as well, because that's also available to you to understand the performance of your investment assets. So, why I find pensions in particular very interesting is because for many people, this is your first window into the investment industry. And you might be thinking, you might be sat there thinking, do you know what? There's all this story about, financial literacy, building generational wealth, trying to, save for the future and being financially smart. And I'm not even investing. I don't even know how to start investing. I wouldn't even know what to do. Now, if you're an employee who's paying into a pension or whose employer is paying into a pension, then by virtue of that, that makes you an investor because all these assets are being invested into the stock market, into alternative assets, and that's a very good window into how the investment industry works. So look at your benefit statement, look at the financial statements, understand where they're investing in. Understand the risk appetite of the pension fund because they will tell you the level of risk that is involved in this type of investments and how that is managed. So you might have your equities and your bonds and your alternative assets. It's going to give you a nice clear split of how the pension fund is investing across all these types of asset classes. It's going to show you how they're performing. It's going to give you insights into the investment strategy. It's really going to help you understand a lot about the investment industry. And so, if you're somebody who wants to learn, I would say that's a very good place to start because that gives you the basics and then you can go and do a bit more digging and learn a bit more about it. Now, the next thing about this is the fact that as anybody who owns a pension, you can nominate who your pension pot goes to in the event that anything happened to you. So you can split it in, say, what particular order and say, I want this pension to go to, say, my wife, or I want this portion of my pension to go to, say, my brother, or this particular portion of my pension to go to my children, and so on and so forth. So when it comes to the whole inheritance angle of it and building that generational wealth, you can be very intentional in terms of how you want that passed on should anything happen to you. Now, let's look at the more practical side of it, which is what we hope happens because you do have that longevity and you end up living into the 90s as is predicted uh, by the pension world. And so you become an individual who then has this source of income that is going to be paid to you as a salary. I'm not going to discuss the different ways in which you can draw down your pension. I'm just going to assume, for the simplicity purposes, for this episode in particular, that you have opted to take your pension as a salary for the rest of your life. So you have this very reliable source of income that's coming to you every single month that you've already paid for. And let's say you are a higher tax rate payer. At the point at which you were building this pension pot, you were paying taxes up to 40% or 45%. Now you've gone into retirement and this is a source of income for you. You're no longer getting income from, an employer. And so what happens is like all the income that you do receive is consolidated and then you're placed into a particular tax bracket. So for simplicity purposes, let's say all the income you're generating places you in the basic rate taxpayer bracket at that point in time. So where you would have paid 45% tax on that income as you were earning it, you are now paying tax as a basic rate taxpayer. So don't ignore your pensions. Pay attention to your pensions, maximize on your pensions, seek financial advice from your financial advisor in the process of doing all this, and make sure that you fully understand how best to maximize the pension opportunities that your employer is giving to you. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode. I hope you've enjoyed it. Leave your comments down below. If you've got any questions, again, leave them in the comment section or drop us an email and we'll be happy to get back to you. So thank you so much for now, and we'll see you next time.